أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم برضوان إلى يوم الدين. So today is the 13th session on reflecting daily reflections on the Quran, and today I'm going to pick up Surah Yunus and Surah Hud. Since there's not enough time to go into detail, I'm going to be covering some overall concepts that deal with these two surahs, inshallah. So these two surahs make an argument for Prophet, for the truthfulness of the message, for the revelation being from Allah. And then it brings about the examples from the stories of the previous prophets and their people and whatever happened to them. So today I'm going to focus on this second aspect of these surahs, the second aspect of the message that these surahs contain. One of the most powerful and most used tool that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses in the Quran to invite us, to make us realize the truthfulness of it, to make us be convinced about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed, to make us be able to change our lives accordingly. A major portion of that tazkir, that reminder, is based on making arguments by narrating about previous people, the previous prophets. And although a lot of times we write them and we teach them to our children as stories, these are not stories. These are not myths. These are narrations about previous people who were from whom we have descended. And these are narrations about real people, real prophets, and their interactions with each other, their arguments, their logic, their ultimate fate. And it covers a span of time which is much bigger than what an individual life consists of. So there are two ways to instill any principles or any methods in human hearts and minds. One is to describe them theoretically, and the other is to describe their effects on the society, on human beings, on their long-term well-being, both in this world and the next world. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses history to define certain principles for us, it's mainly concerned with us as a society, not as an individual. It's not a story of individuals, but stories of communities and societies. So this portion of the Quran is primarily deals with communities and societies and not with individual life, although individuals are may be mentioned in there as an example, and specifically the prophets certainly are mentioned as individuals who carried the message to those societies and those people. These stories primarily concern with us to give us an understanding, give us as an argumentation for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us to implement, both individually and as a society. But here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deals with generations, with groups of people. And whatever consequences groups and generations face is much more than the consequences of individual lives. When societies are built, societies are formed, countries come into existence, its inhabitants come and go, and the individuals are born and die. Some live short lives, some live long life, and the individual lives are elements of that society. But those societies are primarily dealing with us as a collective body. So as a collective bodies, that as societies, the laws that apply to them are different from the laws that apply to human beings. For human beings, the time of their death is written, and there is no way around it, and no one can turn that back, and it is not going to be delayed or hastened even by a moment. But that is not the case with societies. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in the Quran as the society, the collective life of people, as a group, as a society, as a humanity, is not that they have a certain time where they are going to rise and then a certain time they are going to fall and leave the world. Although there are some historians that make from the aspect of rise and fall of civilizations that the world has seen from the beginning of the time, they tend to make that argument that for every society there is a peak and for every society there is a downfall that is written and that is for sure. But that is not what Quran teaches us. What Quran tells us that it is based on their conduct, their overall conduct, their collective conduct in the society. If the societies do good, they continue to improve. And if the societies do bad, then they start to go down. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gives them the chance when they are on the path to destruction that they can turn their lives around and turn back. And so there is no point of no return as collective beings, as a society. You cannot tell about societies or civilizations that they are going down and now they cannot be turned back. Every society there is a turning back. And so the greatest example that we find, especially in the surah is named after Prophet Yunus alayhi salam and the people of Yunus. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically, He mentions so many people, Hud, Saleh, Nuh, and those people were invited, and long time passed of the Prophet trying to convince them, trying to persuade them, and eventually their destruction came. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gives an example of people who finally did take the heed, finally did understood the message of the Prophet, finally were scared of the consequences of their actions, and they turned their life around. And so Allah gave them reprieve, Allah gave them good life after their society was turned back from the path that it was on. So death is not written for societies. It is written for us as individuals, but it is not written for societies that they must die. Second thing is that the society's lifespan of societies and civilizations is much bigger than the lifespan of individuals. And so the consequences that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes, those consequences also appear over a time period that is much bigger than the lifespan of any one individual being. So dealing with the consequences that are slow moving, that take time, and so those consequences look not like our everyday experience. That if you put your hands on the fire, it's going to burn. If you bang your head on the wall, it's going to hurt. And so many things that we are aware of, we immediately see the results of it, and we know it's bad for you. And so we learn to not be involved in it. But the consequences that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes about societies takes time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them mohla, the concept of mohla, the concept of respite, the concept of being given a slack, the concept of being given a time to recover and to turn back applies to the societies as a whole. Because societies their nature is that. And to deal with that nature, that system exists of giving a mohla, a respite, a slack to them, and gives them time to turn their lives around. This is true for individuals as well, but the individuals, the concept of tawbah and istighfar applies. But the same process also applies to the societies. And they can turn themselves around, and they can turn themselves set themselves right and then turn around whatever direction they were moving. So there is no point of losing all hope about any society, any people, that this is it, that now is the end, that now things are coming to an end. That cannot be the case for any people. There is a room to improve and room to turn your lives back. Uh, and also, sometimes when we look at it, when we read these things in the Quran, sometimes we get this strange idea that it's all arbitrary, that Allah gives them respite, but that respite, how that respite comes into being, what is the quantity and the amount of that respite that Allah gives, what is the length of that respite Allah gives. We sometimes think it's arbitrary. Well, to some Allah gives more respite than the other, but that's not my understanding of reading the Quran. Because however Allah operates on people is based on system and law. And if the whole of the universe is bound to a system under which it operates, the whole physical universe is bound to that principle and operates based on that principle. The sun and the earth, they move around in a very particular pattern, in a very particular shape, in a very particular path, and they don't deviate from it even a millimeter. You can imagine for something of the size of the planet not waving from its place even to that level is amazing. It is because of that movement that you are able to calculate time to milliseconds. You can look at your watch and tell a time to milliseconds, to even an atomic time. And you can calculate an atomic time from this day to the next day to the next year, and whatever system operates on the planets and their movements, you can predict where a planet would be exactly for that particular period of time. So the whole universe is bound to a system. It's not arbitrary. Same principles apply to human beings and human societies. And so that system that applies to human societies is also something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls as sunnah. Sunnatullah. And he says, Sunnata man qad arsalna qablaka min rusulina wa la tajidu li sunnatillahi tahwila. You will not find that system changing. So it's not like some people are given more mohla than the others. Everyone is being operated upon exactly the same principles. Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives mohla, He also talks about in the Quran about ajali musamma, that there is an appointed time for you. And He talks about ajali musamma not only just in individual context, but in the societal context as well. And He asked the prophets to relay that to people. Prophet Nuh said to people that you have an ajali musamma as a whole, as a group of people, not just in his individual life. And that ajali musamma is governed by your conduct and what you do and how you live. And so what time it will take for consequences to show up in the society is a fixed time. But it is affected by so many variables, so many factors that we are unable to calculate it. But Allah knows that. And Allah calculates that time for us. And Allah is able to determine that time period for us. And so He does that. So whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in terms of societies and their consequences is also bound to a very particular, very tight system, just like the universe is bound to a tight system. And so if the societies start to go on a path and they don't turn back, then there is a specific distance that they will be able to go. And once that distance is reached, they will get to a point from which they will not be able to turn back. That will be their end, that will be their destruction. And so this is the story that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us through the stories of the prophets. And so when He describes the previous people and messengers and their people and their interactions with each other, He is describing them to us under a rule in which he says that the same laws apply to you as the ones that apply to those before you. Laws are not going to change. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَهَلْ يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَّا سُنَّةَ الْأَوَّلِينَ فَلَنْ تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا وَلَنْ تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَحْوِيلًا. That are they waiting for Allah's laws to be fulfilled regarding them, His sunnah, His laws to be fulfilled, the laws that apply to those before you, that those laws be fulfilled with respect to you as well, and you will not find those laws changing. It will not be any different for you now than what it was for them then. The same laws apply, same laws will work to that. So one of the very common characteristics of all the messengers that gets repeated one after another and after another, and you go to Surah Al-Araf and Surah Yunus and Surah Hud and Surah Qasas and all the coming surahs, and you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly, repeatedly reminds us, does the tazkir from the stories of these previous people and these prophets. And so some of the characteristics, very common characteristics that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes about those people is all the messengers that were sent to those people were sent from among them. None of them were foreigners. None of them come from outside. Their process to reform them, change them, turn them around had to be originated from within them. And that is a very important part of the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us. That no outside force is going to be able to change you. It is you. This applies to us individuals, that we have to change ourselves, but it applies to the societies as well. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا بِرَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ, except in their own language. And lisan, all mufassirin interpret the word lisan broadly in terms of their culture, their nuances, their understanding. And so all messengers were sent to their were from among themselves. The second thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes very clear is all of them, from Adam up until the last messenger, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in between there is a span of time that is thousands and thousands of years. All carried exactly the same message. There was no difference in their messages that they came with. All offered the same worldview. All invited to the same norms and values to be implemented in their lives. All faced opposition. There was none who didn't face opposition. All were mocked by their people. All were asked for miracles, for extraordinary events as proof. And all faced the same consequences, same results on the basis of the same actions. If the action is the same, then the results are also going to be the same. So in this sense, Allah subhanahu, these prophet stories are very essential, very significant. And oftentimes when we apply the word story to it, I think it does a great injustice in our thinking when we use the word story for it. Although the word qasas in Arabic in the modern translation will mean a story, but qasas literally means to go back in footsteps and follow the footsteps that were already formed. And that is really what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to teach us. These are serious things, not stories to be read lying down. This is serious material through which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us, provokes us to stand up, to be afraid, to be scared, to be watchful. And they are as powerful as the verses that we read in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Akhirah and Day of Judgment and people standing before Allah on the Day of Judgment. And so these are as powerful as them. And sometimes I feel that we do great injustice to our children when we teach them and make these stories in a cartoonish style and teach them these stories in a cartoonish fashion. These are serious narrations, serious consequences, serious implications for human beings. They are describing a psychology of human beings and warning them that they must watch out against this behavior that may come about inside you, in you, and through which societies come to a destruction. Much more in the same way that you are afraid of a virus destroying your society right now. It's as serious. And so when we treat them as stories and teach our children stories, just like we teach them stories of other things, teach them other stories of happenings in the world, of fairy tales, of magic, of whatever extraordinary things happening, and we include in that the story of prophets as good stories or moral stories, I think we need to rethink as to how we go about doing this to our children, and take these stories in a serious fashion and teach them in a serious way, because there are great consequences as to how we teach these stories to people and to our children, and we must really present them in a serious fashion, in a serious tone, and not in a light-hearted tone, and not in a way that they think of it as a historical records, a story talking about some people who have passed and it applied to them, but as something that is current, something from which we need to draw lessons and tazkir in our own time currently, something that we should recite and our hearts should shake and we should tremble when we read those stories. And so that is the spirit with which we need to approach these stories. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that people come in successions and the same laws keep applying to them. And the only reason that people get destroyed is that when they do zulm on themselves. This applies to the societies. As I said in the beginning, for societies, death is not written. Their death comes as a result of their collective conduct and not as a result of an appointed time. There is an appointed time that is linked with conduct, that if you continue to do this behavior, then it's not like you can continue to do it forever. Ultimately it's going to come to an end, and that time is set. That is based on Allah's laws. And you must awaken yourself before you reach that limit, before you reach that time. And in the wisdom of Allah, just like for us as human beings, we don't know when the death is going to come upon us. The societies don't know when that time period will come about, even though it is a specific time. And so in that sense, we need to worry about the consequences, and we need to look at those stories in that fashion. And so from that, I want to come to the last part of Surah Hud. I think this is one of the most significant verse that concludes, that summarizes, that tells us the objective of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing all these stories of the prophets in these surahs. And so these are the verses number 116 and 117 of Surah Al-Hud, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَوْلَا كَانَ مِنَ الْقُرُونِ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ أُولُو بَقِيَّةٍ يَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْفَسَادِ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِمَّنْ أَنْجَيْنَا مِنْهُمْ وَاتَّبَعَ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا مَا أُتْرِفُوا فِيهِ وَكَانُوا مُجْرِمِينَ وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ لِيُهْلِكَ الْقُرَى بِظُلْمٍ وَأَهْلُهَا مُصْلِحُونَ. I mean, I think summarizes almost everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us and what I have been saying up until this point. فَلَوْلَا كَانَ مِنَ الْقُرُونِ مِنْ قَبْلِ. So why what wasn't? That from among the people before you, there were remaining people, ulu baqiyatin, who remained, who persisted, ينهون عن الفساد في الأرض, who prevented from corruption being occurring and happening in the world, إلا قليلا ممن أنجينا منهم, except from very few from among the people whom we had saved. وَاتَّبَعَ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا مَا أُتْرِفُوا فِيهِ وَكَانُوا مُجْرِمِينَ, and they followed the same ways and same path of those people who wronged themselves and made themselves be entertained by the same things that they did. وَكَانُوا مُجْرِمِينَ, as a result they were criminals. And so this idea that with the passage of time, those people start to be reduced. I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes all these messengers, especially in Surah Hud, you will come to see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَجَّيْنَا هُودًا وَنَجَّيْنَا صَالِحًا وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ, and those who were with him. And so those were the people who had believed, who were of great character, who didn't deny the Prophet ﷺ, who were worthy of being saved by Allah. But every time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved some people, with the passage of time, فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُم, that with the passage of the time, they started to deteriorate. And they started to fall back to those same paths from which they were saved, or their ancestors were saved before. And so this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the principle, وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ لِيُهْلِكَ الْقُرَى بِظُلْمٍ وَأَهْلُهَا مُصْلِحُونَ. Allah does not just take away people, societies, cities, cultures from the world just to do some wrong to them, to be harsh on them, hard on them. وَأَهْلُهَا مُصْلِحُونَ, if they were muslihun, then Allah will save them. So it's an invitation for those who recognize these truths, those who understand what is wrong with the society, to stand up, because this is another example of it which Prophet ﷺ gave, is riding a boat. All of them are riding the same boat. And if some people decide to dig a hole in the bottom of the boat and other people don't stop from that happening, then all of them are going to be destroyed. And so that is the primary lesson that these two surahs teach us in terms of the lessons that we need to draw from these stories of the prophets. And so these were some of the overall ideas about those stories. And as we go through reciting these surahs, as we come up one prophet after another prophet after another prophet, and this process is going to continue as we continue to recite the next few days and in the surahs that are coming after these surahs. If we can keep these thoughts in mind when we read them, and if we apply seriousness to when we read them and not read them as history or as story, then inshallah it will have an effect on us in terms of making us right, in terms of being able to apply that process of tazkiyah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Quran is revealed for that purpose, to make a tazkiyah, to make you right, to make you better persons, and to draw from these stories emotionally in the same way, and not just take them lightly. So أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.